Before Jason Statham became the iron-willed face of modern action films, he was just a boy growing up in the gray, wind-beaten town of Shirebrook, a place where dreams froze as quickly as the morning air. His story didn't begin with privilege or opportunity, but with the raw reality of survival. His mother, Eileen, had once danced under flickering stage lights, her applause fading long before the bills stopped coming. His father, Barry, was a man of many trades: miner, painter, street vendor, and part-time singer, doing whatever he could to stretch every coin a little further. Their small home carried the scent of coal dust and determination, where laughter was rare, but resilience was constant. From an early age, Jason learned that strength wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built, day after day. While other children played, he followed his father through the markets of Great Yarmouth, learning how to face the world's indifference with grit and humor. Selling cheap jewelry and perfume to strangers who barely looked his way, he discovered the art of persistence before he ever stepped onto a film set. Even then, the young boy who would one day leap from skyscrapers and outfight villains was already training for a different kind of battle, the fight to endure. In a house lit by a single bulb and filled with quiet worry, Jason grew up with one unspoken rule: never stop moving forward, no matter how heavy the day feels. Those early years didn't just shape his toughness. They defined the unbreakable drive that would one day make the world remember his name. When most athletes were already chasing Olympic dreams, Jason Statham was just learning how to dive into the unknown, literally. He discovered his passion for movement not in fancy training halls, but in the rough corners of London's back streets, where concrete replaced swimming pools and determination was his only coach. At 12, an age when others were already years into professional training, he walked into the Crystal Palace National Sports Center with a mix of excitement and quiet defiance. By all measures, he was too late to start. But that never stopped him before. The odds didn't intimidate him, they fueled him. While others packed up for the day, Jason stayed in the water until the janitor shut off the lights. He'd climb the board again and again, the sound of his own breath echoing through the cold, empty pool. There was no applause waiting for him, only the sharp slap of water and the ache in his shoulders reminding him he was alive. The silence became his teacher, the water his mirror. Every failed dive, every imperfect landing only sharpened his will. Years passed like that, endless winters, blistered hands, and countless early mornings. His persistence finally carried him to the 1990 Commonwealth Games, where he proudly represented England. For a brief moment, the boy from Shirebrook seemed ready to leap into Olympic history. But fate had other plans. In 1992, he missed the British Olympic team by a single spot. 10 years of work vanished in one heartbeat. Still, he didn't break. He simply watched the ripples fade and understood something deeper. Life doesn't always reward effort, but it always honors endurance. That pool, cold, silent, and merciless, became the first arena where Jason learned what real strength meant. Not in triumph, but in persistence. The lessons he carried from those dives would follow him into every fight, every stunt, and every challenge the world would later throw his way. When Jason Statham stepped away from the pool after missing his Olympic dream, he didn't just walk away from a sport. He walked into silence. The kind of silence that tests a person's spirit. Years of sacrifice, aching muscles, and discipline vanished in a single decision made by someone else. For most people, that kind of disappointment would leave a permanent crack. But for Jason, it became the forge. What the world saw as failure, he treated as a lesson. The water had taught him something no coach ever could: that life doesn't always reward effort, but endurance always builds strength. In the years that followed, he learned to see rejection not as an ending, but as a teacher in disguise. Every closed door pushed him to find another way in. The calm, patient stillness that once guided him through each dive became the same focus that would one day drive him through the chaos of film sets, through explosions and fight choreography. The silence of the pool had shaped him. It had carved his patience into steel. He often spoke of his father, not as a man who preached strength, but as one who lived it. Barry Statham never gave speeches about courage. He showed it through action, through late nights, endless work, and the refusal to give up when the world offered nothing in return. Jason carried that quiet resilience into every corner of his life. He learned that true toughness doesn't come from victory or recognition. It's built in the shadows, when no one's watching, when you get up after life has knocked you flat. That missed Olympic dream could have ended his story before it began. Instead, it gave him the mindset that would define his career. Never expect the world to hand you anything. Earn it. Fall, rise, and repeat until you forget what quitting feels like. Long before he became Hollywood's untouchable action star, Jason Statham had already mastered the hardest art of all: how to stand tall after falling short. When the water no longer offered him a future, the streets of London became his next training ground. Gone were the diving boards and bright lights of competition, replaced by gray skies, cold markets, and the hum of survival. Jason Statham had no safety net, no plan, and no connections. What he did have was a stubborn refusal to give up. He began selling whatever he could get his hands on: cheap watches, imitation perfumes, trinkets that promised a little glamour to people who could barely afford it. His stall was his new arena, and his voice was his weapon. Each day was a test of endurance. Rain soaked his clothes, wind bit through his coat, and still he stood there, calling out to strangers who rarely even looked his way. He wasn't proud of the hustle, but he was proud that he never crossed the line into dishonesty. "I sold what I had because I refused to steal what I didn't," he would say years later. That sentence carried the weight of everything he had lived through: dignity in poverty, pride in survival. Nights were colder. Sometimes he slept in cramped flats with strangers, sometimes in rooms where the windows didn't close and the heat had long died. A tin of beans, a cheap sandwich, a cup of tea, that was dinner. But when the city went quiet, he trained. Push-ups beside the bed, shadowboxing in front of cracked mirrors, moving in the dark while everyone else slept. Every repetition was his rebellion against defeat. He didn't realize it then, but London's streets were shaping his future as much as the pool once did. They taught him rhythm, grit, and presence, skills that would one day make him magnetic on camera. The same eyes that once scanned crowds for customers would later hold the intensity of an action hero. The same voice that pitched perfume would sell entire movie scenes without a single word. In those years of hunger and hardship, Jason wasn't just surviving, he was becoming. The man who would someday face explosions, betrayals, and heartbreak on screen was already in training, right there among the rain and neon lights of London. Fate has a strange sense of timing. Just when Jason Statham's life seemed destined to stay trapped in the endless grind of London's street markets, an unexpected opportunity appeared. Not from film, but from fashion. One afternoon, while training at the same sports center that had once been his temple of discipline, he caught the attention of scouts from a London agency called Sports Promotions. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for authenticity. Jason had that in every scar, every stare, every hard-earned line on his face. Before long, the former diver and street vendor found himself in front of cameras instead of behind a market stall. He modeled for brands like Tommy Hilfiger, Levi's, and French Connection. Campaigns that wanted men who looked real, not rehearsed. He didn't smile much, didn't pose like others did. He simply stood there, the rawness of his life written across his expression. And that was exactly what the industry didn't know it was missing. Those photos paid only a few pounds, but what they gave him was priceless. A glimpse of possibility. Still, this new life wasn't glamorous. Between shoots, Jason often returned to the same streets he used to sell on, still hustling to make ends meet. The lights in the studio were bright, but they didn't keep the cold out at night. He would later laugh about it, saying he was a hustler even in a designer suit. But behind the humor was truth. Modeling didn't make him famous. It gave him belief. Belief that maybe, after years of silence and struggle, his story wasn't over. And then, as if destiny had been waiting for him to stop chasing, it came knocking, literally. Through a modeling contact, Jason met a young filmmaker named Guy Ritchie, who was preparing his first movie. Ritchie didn't see a model or a salesman. He saw something else, a man who had lived the kind of truth you can't fake. That encounter would soon open the door Jason had been fighting toward his entire life. Some meetings change everything. And for Jason Statham, that meeting was with Guy Ritchie. The young director was casting for his gritty debut film, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, and needed someone who could play a street hustler without pretending. Someone who didn't just act tough, but was tough. When a mutual contact introduced Jason, Ritchie didn't ask for an audition. He asked him to talk. About life, about London, about the hustle. Jason didn't perform. He just spoke the way he always had, straight from experience, sharp and unpolished. Within minutes, Ritchie knew this wasn't a role Jason had to play. It was one he'd already lived. That conversation turned into a $5,000 role. Small on paper, but life-changing in reality. Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels exploded into a cult phenomenon in 1998, introducing the world to a new kind of actor. Raw, real, and magnetic. Audiences didn't see acting. They saw authenticity. Every glare, every line Jason delivered carried the weight of someone who had seen struggle up close. His silence spoke louder than most dialogue. Success came quickly, but it didn't soften him. He knew how easily fortunes could vanish. He'd lived that truth before. When Snatch arrived 2 years later, starring alongside Brad Pitt, Jason's name was no longer just a credit in the end titles. It was a presence audiences couldn't ignore. The world had finally caught up to what his grit had been building all along. From that moment, everything changed. He was no longer selling stories on a street corner. He was living them on screen. Yet deep inside, Jason remained the same man who once counted coins under flickering kitchen lights. The fame, the red carpets, the global applause, none of it could erase the memory of those cold London nights. Instead, it grounded him. His rise wasn't luck. It was the final result of years spent preparing for a chance he didn't even know was coming. Once Jason Statham stepped into Hollywood, there was no turning back. What started as a gritty debut with Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels evolved into a full-blown revolution in action cinema. Unlike many actors who let stunt doubles take the hits, Jason insisted on taking every punch, kick, and fall himself. It wasn't arrogance, it was authenticity. He had spent his life earning every scar, and now he turned that pain into performance. When The Transporter hit theaters in 2002, audiences instantly recognized something rare. A hero who didn't just look tough, he was tough. He trained relentlessly for months, mastering martial arts disciplines like Wing Chun, kickboxing, and Krav Maga. Every move on screen was choreographed with the precision of a man who understood control and the cost of it. He refused safety shortcuts. If he got hurt, he'd joke, "At least it's honest." Torn ligaments, bruised ribs, a shoulder that still clicks to this day. Those were the receipts of his dedication. Each stunt wasn't just a scene. It was a statement that real courage doesn't need a camera to prove it. By the time Crank and The Expendables arrived, Jason had cemented himself as Hollywood's new breed of action star, one who blended intensity with authenticity. The critics called him the last of the real ones. Sylvester Stallone, who would later cast him alongside legends like Jet Li and Dolph Lundgren, famously said, "Jason doesn't act like a tough guy. He is one." But behind the adrenaline and fire, the schedule was brutal. Filming 2 movies a year, crossing continents, Training at dawn, fighting at dusk, he lived in a cycle of pain and persistence. The lights never stopped flashing, and the cameras never stopped rolling. Yet even at the peak of his fame, the boy from Shirebrook hadn't disappeared. He still carried that quiet discipline, that hunger that began long before the world knew his name. He wasn't just performing action, he was action, personified. For a man built on grit, failure wasn't new. But in Hollywood, it cut deeper. After years of dominance in the action genre, Jason Statham hit a stretch where the punches stopped landing. The early 2000s had crowned him as the new face of adrenaline, yet the industry that once praised him began to whisper a cruel word: replaceable. His reunion with Guy Ritchie in Revolver was supposed to be a cinematic triumph, but instead it flopped, both critically and financially. What was meant to reaffirm his legacy instead left him staring down headlines calling it pretentious and empty. He didn't lash out or make excuses. He did what he'd always done: endured. But Hollywood doesn't pause for reflection. It moved on, fast. Films like War and Wildcard followed, struggling to find an audience, each box office disappointment chipping away at the myth of invincibility he'd built. While other stars shifted toward safer roles or comedic rebrands, Jason refused to compromise. He stayed true to his identity: the fighter, the survivor, the man who turned scars into stories. Then, just as the noise of doubt began to drown his name, he struck back. The bank job in 2008 changed everything. Gone were the explosions and superhuman stunts, replaced by sharp storytelling, realism, and focus. Jason showed the world he wasn't just fists and fury. He was discipline and depth. The film's success reignited his reputation, proving that intelligence could be as powerful as impact. That comeback opened the doors to The Expendables and Fast and Furious 7, placing him alongside the very legends he'd once idolized. But those moments of victory didn't erase the scars of the struggle. They reminded him that fame is fragile, and survival is earned over and over again. Every flop, every insult, every bruise had only sharpened him. Jason Statham didn't just return to the top, he fought his way there, one failure at a time, and refused to let defeat become his final scene. Behind the explosions, the applause, and the billion-dollar box office totals, Jason Statham carried something far heavier than fame: the quiet weight of loss. For a man who had built his reputation on surviving danger, nothing could prepare him for the day it turned real. In 2011, while filming The Expendables 2 in Bulgaria, what began as another action sequence turned into a moment that would haunt him forever. A stunt explosion went off seconds too early, taking the life of a young stunt performer named Kun Liu, a man who had looked up to Jason, who had told him that very morning, "One day, I'll be where you are." By nightfall, that dream was gone. Jason was there when it happened, running toward the wreckage, shouting, helpless. The shock was immediate, the silence unbearable. Later, when reporters asked about it, he said only, "We lost one of us." It was all he could manage. From that day on, the fearless action star became a man more aware of how thin the line between performance and tragedy really was. Every explosion, every crash, every fight scene became a reminder of the risks his profession demanded, not just for him, but for everyone beside him. 2 years later, another blow arrived. Paul Walker, his co-star and friend from Fast and Furious 7, died in a car crash while leaving a charity event. For Jason, it felt like déjà vu: the sound of engines, the sudden silence, the sense that fate had taken someone good far too soon. He attended the memorial quietly. No cameras, no speeches, just tears. He later said, "The world lost a star. We lost family." Those moments reshaped him. The man once defined by speed and defiance learned humility through grief. He began demanding safer sets, personally training with stunt teams, and honoring every crew member who risked their lives beside him. Behind his stoic calm was a man still replaying memories he couldn't change, faces that never made it home. To the world, he remained indestructible. But inside, Jason Statham carried the invisible bruises that no film could ever capture. The pain of knowing that survival always comes with a price. After decades of chasing danger, Jason Statham found himself standing somewhere he had never truly been before. Stillness. At 58, the man who had built his life on speed, impact, and motion began to understand the quiet value of peace. The bruises from countless stunts had faded into memory. But the deeper wounds, the losses, the exhaustion, the loneliness that fame could never cure, lingered beneath the surface. He had spent years proving he could survive anything. Now, for the first time, he wanted to learn how to simply live. His peace arrived softly in the form of love. Meeting Rosie Huntington Whiteley changed everything. She wasn't drawn to the fame or the legend. She saw the man behind the armor. With her, Jason rediscovered what it meant to breathe, to laugh without cameras watching, to trade chaos for comfort. Their home life became his anchor. Pancakes in the morning, laughter with their 2 children, Jack and Isabella, and quiet evenings where the only applause came from tiny hands clapping over bedtime stories. "Privacy is our peace," he once said, and he meant it. But even peace carries its shadows. Sometimes when the house falls silent and his family sleeps, Jason still stands by the doorway, remembering the past that nearly broke him. The pool where he lost his dream, the streets that taught him hunger, the friends he buried. Those memories don't haunt him anymore. They humble him. They remind him that every scar has a story, and every story is proof that he's still standing. He no longer chases fame, headlines, or the illusion of invincibility. His life now is built on gratitude, for survival, for love, for meaning. The same man who once dove into the freezing waters of the Black Sea to escape death now dives into fatherhood with the same intensity. He understands what few ever do. Peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the victory that follows it. Jason Statham, once the symbol of unbreakable strength, has become something greater, a reminder that even warriors deserve rest, and that true power lies not in never falling, but in rising with grace, again and again.